Story 1. The Substitute Who Never Left. It started the week Mr. Halpern called in sick. He was Westview High's history teacher, gray suit, calm voice, the kind of man who could make even the American Revolution sound like a lullaby. So when he didn't show up one Monday morning, nobody worried much. Teachers got the flu all the time. The school secretary just taped a note on his door, substitute assigned, Mr. Holloway. That name didn't ring a bell. When the bell rang and the students shuffled in, Mr. Holloway was already there, standing perfectly still at the front of the room. He was tall, pale, with a posture too straight to be comfortable. His suit looked decades out of fashion, faded and frayed at the cuffs. His eyes were gray, so light they seemed almost white. "Good morning, class," he said, his voice soft and perfectly enunciated. "Let's begin." There was no introduction, no roll call. He simply turned to the chalkboard and began writing. Long sentences in looping, beautiful handwriting that looked more like calligraphy than chalk. At first, it seemed like a normal history lecture. But as the day went on, things began to feel off. The windows fogged, though it wasn't cold outside. The fluorescent lights flickered rhythmically, like a heartbeat. And every time a student dropped a pen or shifted in their chair, Mr. Holloway would pause, tilt his head slightly, and smile, too slowly. By Wednesday, the class had stopped joking about him. They sat still, spoke softly, avoided looking at him too long. Something about him made people's stomachs tighten. He never blinked during lectures. Not once. He didn't eat lunch in the teacher's lounge either. The janitor, Mr. Darnell, said he'd seen Holloway standing by the windows during recess, just watching the playground. In the rain. Not moving. When a few students asked about Mr. Halpern's return, Holloway smiled and said, "He's still here, in a way." Every teacher leaves a piece of themselves behind. Nobody understood what that meant. But when he said it, the air temperature in the classroom seemed to drop a few degrees. One Thursday afternoon, the class president, Emily Vargas, stayed behind to pick up her books. The room was empty. Or at least, she thought it was. She bent down to grab a notebook, and when she stood up, Mr. Holloway was right behind her. "You forgot this," he said, holding out her pencil case. She froze. He was too close. His eyes didn't move like normal eyes. They glided, slow and mechanical, locking onto her face with a faint tremor. "Thank you," she stammered, stepping back. He smiled. Good students are rare. That night, Emily had a nightmare. She dreamt she was sitting in his classroom, but every student's face was gone, blank skin where features should be. Mr. Holloway stood at the front, whispering, "Don't leave. There's still so much to learn." She woke up gasping, her sheets soaked with sweat. The alarm clock said 3:07 a.m. Outside her bedroom window, someone was humming the school anthem. On Friday, the real Mr. Halpern came back. Or at least, that's what everyone thought at first. He looked different. Gaunter, quieter, his smile stretched too wide. He said the flu had hit him hard. But during class, when a student asked him a question about the previous week's lessons, he hesitated, frowned, and said, "You mean Mr. Holloway didn't cover that." The entire room fell silent. "We thought you were sick," one student said. Halpern blinked. He stopped mid-sentence, glancing at the chalkboard. There, faintly visible beneath the day's notes, were words scrawled in long, looping chalk script. "The substitute never leaves." Halpern dropped his chalk. Later that day, Principal Wagner called Halpern into his office. "About your sub," the principal said. "Strangest thing, there's no record of any Mr. Holloway on our roster. Not in the district system, not with HR. I assumed you'd found him through the sub pool." Halpern shook his head. "No, I didn't request anyone. I just got sick. They must have assigned him automatically." The principal frowned. "We don't do automatic assignments, Ben. You know that." Then he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You're sure it was Holloway teaching here?" Halpern nodded. "For a week straight." The principal stared at him for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a faded black and white photo. It was a staff picture, dated 1956. "Is this him?" Halpern's blood ran cold. There, in the back row, stood a man with the same face, same posture, same light eyes. The caption read, Mr. A. Holloway, History Department. He can't be, Halpern whispered. That's 70 years ago. The principal closed the drawer. That's what I thought too. That night, the janitor stayed late. Around midnight, he heard voices coming from room 204, Halpern's classroom. Thinking it was kids breaking in, he went to check. Through the glass, he saw the lights flickering inside. Students sat in rows, silent, faces pale as candle wax. At the front of the class stood Mr. Holloway, writing on the board. Except the students weren't really there. Their bodies were translucent, their movements repeating, mechanical, like a film loop. The janitor backed away slowly, his mop handle trembling. As he turned the corner, he heard Holloway's voice echo down the hall. Late again, Mr. Darnell. Take your seat. The next morning, the janitor didn't show up for work. Police searched the school that weekend but found nothing unusual, except that room 204's windows had been painted over from the inside. When the officers scraped the paint off, they found something strange underneath. Not chalk marks. Not graffiti. Fingerprints. Hundreds of them. Small. Like children's. Classes resumed the following Monday. Halpern tried to continue as normal, but students kept whispering about Holloway. Some swore they saw him standing in the parking lot at dawn. Others said they heard his voice on the intercom between classes. Good morning, students. Remember, attendance is forever. The intercom crackled and cut off. When the principal checked the system logs, there was no record of any announcement being made. That night, the power went out across the entire school. The security cameras captured only brief flickers of movement in the halls, shadowy figures sitting at desks that weren't there during the day. And in one frame, for a single second, Mr. Holloway's pale face stared straight into the lens. It all ended, or so they thought, on November 12th. A fire broke out in the history wing just after midnight. The flames gutted room 204 completely. When firefighters arrived, they found no bodies. But in the ashes of the chalkboard, they discovered something that made every investigator pause. A set of handwriting impressions burned into the surface, forming words so faint they almost looked like scratches. Class dismissed. The school was closed for renovation for nearly a year. When it reopened, they sealed off the old hallway and built new classrooms around it. But students still talk about that corridor, the one with no doors, where the lights always flicker, and where you can still hear faint chalk sounds echoing when you walk past at night. 5 years later, Westview High reopened fully. The new principal, Ms. Lewis, wanted a fresh start. She hired new staff, modernized the classrooms, even installed digital smartboards. But when the first day of the new school year arrived, her secretary handed her a staff list. At the bottom of the page, typed in clean black font, was a name she didn't recognize. Holloway, A. History Department. She frowned. That must be a mistake. I didn't hire a Holloway. The secretary checked the database. It's in the system. He's scheduled for room 204. Lewis blinked. We don't have a room 204 anymore. The secretary hesitated, scrolling through her monitor. That's strange. It's there in the floor plan, though. See. Right here, West Wing. When Lewis looked, she saw it. A single rectangular space that wasn't supposed to exist, labeled in faded letters, 204. That afternoon, a group of students swore they saw a tall man in an old gray suit walking down the west corridor, carrying a stack of papers. When they called out to him, he turned, smiled faintly, and said, "Don't be late. Class has already started." Then he vanished around a corner that wasn't there. The camera lingers on the rebuilt hallway, empty, silent. The lights buzz softly. The walls hum with faint static. Then, as the shot slowly pans toward a sealed door at the end of the corridor, faint scratching sounds begin, chalk against slate, rhythmic and patient. The camera zooms closer. The scratching stops. From behind the door, a man's voice whispers, "Open your books to page 72. Fade to black." Story 2. The Teacher Who Never Smiled. No one in Willow Creek High ever saw Mrs. Keller smile. Not once. Not in the hallways, not during class, not even in yearbook photos. She had been teaching there for over 15 years, and every student who passed through her classroom described the same eerie presence. A woman who moved too quietly, spoke too softly, and watched too intently. Her classroom sat at the end of the oldest wing of the school, where the lights flickered and the air smelled faintly of mold and dust. The walls were lined with faded portraits of past students, projects from long ago, she claimed, but their eyes always seemed to follow whoever walked in. Students often joked that she lived at the school. No one had ever seen her arrive in the morning or leave at night. It was as if she was simply there, like part of the building itself. When a new student named Ethan transferred in mid-semester, he was placed in Mrs. Keller's English class. He was immediately warned by other students to keep his head down. "Don't talk when she's writing," one of them whispered. "Don't ask about her husband. And whatever you do, don't stay after class." Ethan laughed it off. He'd heard creepy teacher rumors before. Every school had one, some legend about a haunted classroom or a ghostly janitor. But by the end of his first week, Ethan started to notice things he couldn't explain. For one, Mrs. Keller never blinked. She'd stare at a student for nearly a full minute without moving. Her dark eyes were glassy, almost reflective, and when she spoke, her lips barely moved, as though the words were coming from somewhere behind her. During class, she'd make the students read aloud one by one. Her voice, when she corrected them, was calm but cold, like someone reading a eulogy. But sometimes, she'd stop abruptly, mid-sentence, and look toward the corner of the room, whispering something under her breath. When asked what she was saying, she would just respond, reminding them to behave. No one ever asked who them was. One afternoon, the school held parent-teacher conferences. Ethan's mother met with Mrs. Keller and came home pale and silent. When Ethan asked how it went, she just said, "I think she knows things she shouldn't." That night, Ethan overheard his mom talking on the phone with someone. Her voice was trembling. "She asked about my mother," she whispered. "How could she know that? I've never told anyone at the school." The next day, Ethan noticed something new. Mrs. Keller had a small notebook on her desk. Every few minutes, she'd write something in it, glance up at him, and then write again. When the bell rang, she closed the book with deliberate slowness and said, "Ethan, stay for a moment." His friends gave him a look of horror as they left. She waited until the room was empty, then smiled. Not a warm or kind smile, but something strained, unnatural, like she was forcing her face to remember how. "You look just like your grandmother," she said softly. "The same eyes." Ethan froze. His grandmother had died before he was born. He had never seen a photo of her until recently, just last week, when his mom finally showed him one from an old family album. Mrs. Keller stood, her movements slow and deliberate. "She was in my class once. Back when I first started teaching." "That's not possible," Ethan stammered. "You'd have to be older," she finished. "Yes, I suppose I should be." Her voice trembled slightly. "But this place, it keeps me." She opened the little notebook and turned it toward him. It was filled with names. Hundreds of them. Every page was a list of students, written in perfect, looping handwriting. Some names were crossed out. Others were circled. Ethan's name was at the bottom of the latest page. Next to it, she had written one word: soon. He bolted from the room and didn't stop running until he was outside. That night, he begged his mom to let him switch schools. She agreed without question. But the next morning, when they drove to withdraw him, the principal told them something strange. "There's no teacher named Mrs. Keller," he said, flipping through his staff list. "We haven't had anyone by that name for over 10 years. Ethan's mom insisted she had met her the night before. The principal frowned and went to pull the personnel files. When he came back, his face was pale. "There was a Mrs. Keller," he said quietly. "But she died in 1998. Her classroom caught fire during detention. 3 students were trapped with her." Ethan's mother gripped his hand. "What room was it?" she asked. The principal hesitated. "Room 217. That was the room Ethan had been in all week. They want to see it." The hallway smelled faintly of smoke, like something that had never quite been scrubbed away. Room 217 was sealed shut, the door marked storage, "Do not enter." But through the small window in the door, Ethan could see inside. The desks were still there, perfectly arranged, covered in a layer of dust. On the blackboard, faintly visible under the grime, were the words, "Be still and listen." And on the teacher's desk sat a small, leather-bound notebook, its last page open, a fresh name written neatly in blue ink. Ethan's. That night, he woke to the sound of soft chalk scratching against the walls of his room. When he turned on the light, there was a single sentence written across the mirror above his dresser. "Homework due tomorrow, Ethan." The handwriting was unmistakable. He moved out of Willow Creek the next week, but every school he attended afterward, every classroom he entered, he'd sometimes catch sight of a figure at the back. A woman standing still, watching him, unsmiling. And if he looked too long, she would raise a single finger to her lips, as if to say, "Be still and listen." Story 3. The Substitute Who Knew Too Much. It was supposed to be a normal Monday morning at Ashwood High. The air was heavy with rain, the halls echoed with the dull rhythm of sneakers on linoleum, and the students were half awake, dragging their backpacks like anchors. But something felt different that day. Everyone noticed it, even if they couldn't explain why. When the first bell rang, room 112 was unusually quiet. The students shuffled in, whispering to each other about the announcement they'd heard that morning. "Mr. Lang won't be in today. Please welcome your substitute teacher, Mr. Grayson." Nobody knew who Mr. Grayson was. They'd never seen him before, and the office couldn't even say where he came from. At exactly 8:05, the classroom door creaked open. A man stepped in, tall, thin, and dressed in a charcoal gray suit that seemed too formal for a high school. His face was pale, his dark hair neatly combed, and his eyes were strange. They were a silvery gray, like polished mirrors that reflected everything but revealed nothing. "Good morning, class," he said, his voice calm but oddly flat. "I'll be filling in for Mr. Lang." The students stared. There was something off about him, something too precise. Every movement he made seemed rehearsed, every blink perfectly timed. He placed his leather briefcase on the desk, opened it, and pulled out a stack of papers. "Pop quiz," he said. Groans filled the room, but he ignored them. As he handed out the sheets, one student, Hannah, frowned. Mr. Grayson," she said, "we haven't even started this unit yet." He looked at her for a long moment. "You will," he said softly. "Soon." The quiz was strange, questions no one could answer. Things like, "Where were you at 3:17 a.m. last night? What color was the door in your dream? What did you hear whisper your name?" Everyone laughed nervously, assuming it was some weird joke. But when the papers were returned at the end of class, each student noticed something chilling. The answers were already filled in, written in their own handwriting. And every response was correct. When the bell rang, the students bolted for the door. But Hannah stayed behind. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Mr. Grayson smiled faintly. "Just someone who's been here longer than you think." She didn't understand what he meant until later that day. In the library, she found an old yearbook from the 1980s. As she flipped through the pages, her heart stopped. There he was. Mr. Grayson, listed under faculty, wearing the exact same suit, the same expression, the same unaging face. But the caption beneath his photo read, "Deceased, 1987, in classroom fire." That night, Hannah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those gray eyes staring at her. At around 3 a.m., she heard tapping on her window. When she looked, she saw someone standing outside in the rain. It was him. "Mr. Grayson," she screamed, waking her parents, but when they rushed to the window, he was gone. The next morning, she came to school exhausted. Her friends said she looked pale. When she told them what happened, they laughed it off. But as they walked into class, their laughter died. Mr. Grayson was waiting at the front of the room. His clothes were completely dry, his hair perfectly in place. He smiled at Hannah as she entered. "Rough night?" he asked quietly. The class fell silent. Halfway through the lesson, the lights flickered. Mr. Grayson didn't react. He just kept writing on the board. Then, without turning around, he said, "Do you know what happens when a teacher dies in their classroom?" No one answered. He turned slowly, his gray eyes shimmering in the dim light. "They keep teaching," he said. The room went cold. Students started whispering, asking if it was a prank. Mister. Grayson continued, his voice deepening. When the fire came, they thought it was an accident. But it wasn't. The students locked the door. They wanted to scare him. They wanted to watch him panic. The walls seemed to creak around them, as if reacting to his words. Mister. Grayson's expression didn't change. They laughed while the smoke filled the room. They thought it was funny. Until it wasn't. He looked directly at Hannah. I was supposed to move on, he whispered. But every time a new teacher steps into my room, I come back. Because I still have lessons to finish. The lights went out. Screams filled the dark room. When they came back on, the desk at the front was empty. The board was covered in writing, not words, but names. Every student in the class. At the bottom was a new line being written by invisible chalk, Mr. Lang. The principal called the police when no one could find Mr. Lang or the substitute. But the security footage made it even stranger. At 8:04 a.m., a tall man in a gray suit walked into room 112. At 8:45, the lights flickered and the classroom camera glitched. When the feed returned, the man was gone, completely vanished. But there was something else. In the reflection of the classroom window, for a split second before the screen cut out, you could see the faces of 3 other people standing behind him, smiling students, burned and blackened by fire. After that day, room 112 was sealed off. The janitors refused to clean it, and teachers avoided the entire hallway. But sometimes, students passing by would hear faint chalk writing on the blackboard or a soft voice saying, "Eyes forward, class." Pop quiz. Years later, the school reopened the room for a new semester. The teacher assigned to it was a young woman fresh out of college. On her first day, she found a leather briefcase waiting on the desk. Inside was a stack of papers titled Lesson Plans, Mr. Grayson. The first page read, Lesson 1, The Fire Never Ends. The lesson never stops. The students never leave. That night, as she was locking up the room, she caught her reflection in the window, and behind her, a tall figure in a gray suit smiled faintly and said, "Good work today, MS. Keller." She turned, but the room was empty. And in the quiet, the chalk began to move on its own, scratching one final word on the blackboard, continue. Story 4. The counselor who watched the walls whisper. The guidance office at Fairview High always smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. Its walls were covered with cheerful posters about self-esteem and college readiness. But beneath the bright slogans, there were cracks, hairline fractures running down the faded paint, like veins. Nobody really noticed them. Nobody except the new counselor, Mr. Bell. He arrived mid-semester, after the previous counselor abruptly resigned. The principal didn't give details, just said she needed time off. Mr. Bell was polite, soft-spoken, and almost too calm, with a measured way of speaking that made students feel like every word they said mattered. He had kind eyes, a faint smile, and always wore perfectly pressed clothes, as if he'd stepped out of another decade. At first, everyone liked him. He listened. He remembered names. He even stayed late to help students struggling with anxiety or bad grades. But there was something strange about him too, something subtle. He never seemed to blink for long. He didn't use the computers, preferring to write everything down on old yellowed paper. And he always kept his office door open, except during sessions. That was his rule. If a student was in distress, he would close the door. To protect privacy, he'd say with a gentle smile. And when the door closed, the hall outside went eerily quiet. Too quiet. No voices. No footsteps. Not even the sound of the air conditioner. Teachers who passed by sometimes paused, thinking they heard faint noises, like whispering or scratching inside the walls. But when they leaned closer, it always stopped. One afternoon, a student named Paige was called in. She'd been missing classes and seemed withdrawn, so the principal sent her to see Mr. Bell. "Come in, Paige," he said warmly as she hesitated in the doorway. "Have a seat. Let's talk about what's been troubling you." She sat, fidgeting with her sleeves. "I just don't feel right lately," she said quietly. "Like someone's watching me all the time. Even when I'm home." Mr. Bell nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That must be frightening. But you know, sometimes the feeling of being watched isn't from outside," he said, leaning forward slightly. Sometimes it's the walls themselves. They remember things. Paige frowned. The walls. He smiled faintly, as if she'd said something amusing. Every room holds its history. Every whisper, every tear. The walls absorb it. Sometimes, if you listen closely enough, they whisper back. She forced a nervous laugh, thinking it was just a strange metaphor. But then he said softly, "Would you like to hear them?" Before she could answer, he reached out and placed his hand against the wall beside his desk. The fluorescent lights flickered once. The air grew heavier, thicker. "Listen," he whispered. At first, there was nothing. Then, a sound, faint and distant, like voices bleeding through an old radio. Crying. Screams muffled by plaster. Paige's blood ran cold. "Do you hear them?" he murmured, eyes wide now, face strangely lit by the flickering bulbs. "All the secrets these children told me. They never really leave." Paige bolted from the room, sobbing. She told the principal what happened, but when they returned to the office, Mr. Bell was calmly sitting at his desk, smiling pleasantly. "We just talked about her stress," he said, as if nothing had happened. Teenagers can be quite imaginative. There was no proof. No recording. The principal apologized to him and sent Paige home early. But that night, Paige couldn't sleep. Her bedroom walls seemed to hum softly. When she pressed her ear against the plaster, she heard faint whispering. A man's voice saying her name. The next day, she didn't come to school. 2 more students were sent to Mr. Bell that week, both for unrelated issues. Both came out pale, trembling, unable to explain what they'd seen. One of them, a boy named Mason, refused to go near the counseling office again. He told his friends the walls moved while he was in there. They were breathing, he whispered, like the whole room was alive. By Friday, rumors spread through the halls. Some said the old counselor had gone insane because of the same office. Others claimed she still worked there, only now she lived inside the walls. Curious and frightened, a teacher named MS. Cole decided to confront Mr. Bell after hours. She stayed late, pretending to grade papers, and waited until everyone else had gone home. Then she crept down the empty hallway to his office. The light was still on. Peeking through the small glass window in the door, she froze. Mr. Bell was standing by the wall, both palms pressed flat against it, whispering rapidly in a voice she didn't recognize. The wallpaper rippled faintly, as if something beneath it was trying to push through. "MS." Cole gasped. "Mr." Bell turned suddenly, his eyes completely black. He smiled, not kindly this time, but wide and wrong. "You shouldn't listen," he said through the glass. His voice echoed strangely, like several voices overlapping. "They only speak to those who are meant to join them." She ran. The next morning, she didn't show up for work. Her car was still in the parking lot, and the janitor swore he heard someone crying softly from inside the counselor's office before sunrise. When police arrived, the room was empty. Mr. Bell was gone. But on the wall, behind where his desk used to be, the paint was peeling away. Beneath it were dozens of faint handprints, pressed into the plaster as if people had tried to claw their way out. In the days that followed, the school boarded up the office. They claimed it was for renovation, but the students knew better. Some said that if you walked past it late at night, you could still hear the scratching. Others said that if you pressed your ear against the wood, you could hear Mr. Bell's calm, measured voice whispering, "Tell me what's troubling you." Years later, when the building was renovated, a construction crew opened the sealed room. Inside, the air was stale, thick with mold. But the walls, those same walls, were covered in carvings. Words etched in fingernails, overlapping one another, like hundreds of desperate voices trying to speak at once. At the center of the wall, written in neat, elegant handwriting, was a single phrase, "The counselor listens." When the foreman touched it, the lights flickered. From somewhere deep within the plaster, a faint voice whispered, almost gentle, almost kind, "And he never stops." Story 5. The classroom that ate time. Fairview High had an old wing that most teachers avoided. The floors were warped, the lights flickered, and the smell of damp wood and dust lingered even after the janitors scrubbed it. The wing had been closed for repairs for years, except for one room. Room 213. It wasn't on the new maps of the school. But sometimes, when students wandered the hallways during study period or got lost looking for a bathroom, they'd find themselves standing in front of its door without remembering how they got there. The brass number above the frame gleamed faintly under the dim light, as if it had been recently polished. The first person to officially reopen room 213 was Mr. Landry, a history teacher in his 40s with thinning hair and a nervous smile. He was new to the school and eager to prove himself, so when the principal mentioned that the room could use a touch-up, he volunteered to use it for his elective course. It was an ordinary classroom, at least at first glance. Old wooden desks, a chalkboard stained with decades of lessons, and tall windows that looked out into the courtyard. But the air inside was heavy, still, as if the room hadn't been disturbed in a very long time. When Mr. Landry stood at the board for the first time, chalk in hand, he noticed something odd. The clock on the wall was ticking backward. He laughed, thinking it was broken, and removed it to replace the batteries. But when he turned it around, there were no batteries. No mechanism at all, just a smooth, sealed case. He shrugged it off. Just a weird old clock, he muttered. That semester, Mr. Landry's elective class filled quickly. 20 students signed up, eager for an easy grade and his reputation for being chill. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. He lectured about ancient civilizations, graded essays, and occasionally joked about how the room smelled like history. But then, strange things began to happen. One afternoon, halfway through class, the lights flickered and went out. For a few seconds, everything was silent except for the steady tick of that backward clock. When the lights came back on, every student stared at Mr. Landry wide-eyed. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Mr. Landry," one girl whispered, "class is over." The bell already rang. He frowned. No, it didn't. But when he glanced at the hallway, he saw students streaming past. He checked his watch. It was 4:30. School had ended over an hour ago. He swore they'd only been in class for 20 minutes. The next day, it happened again. And again. Every time they entered room 213, time seemed to twist. Sometimes the bell would ring early, other times it wouldn't ring at all. Once, when the class ended, they stepped out into a hallway completely empty and dark. The clock in the hall said 7 p.m. The students began to whisper that something was wrong with the room. One boy, Tyler, claimed he could hear whispers when the lights went off, like voices from behind the walls. Another swore he saw movement in the reflection of the classroom windows, shadows walking in the wrong direction. Mr. Landry tried to laugh it off, but deep down, he was scared too. The air in the room always felt colder than the rest of the school, and sometimes, when he erased the chalkboard, faint outlines of previous lessons would reappear, written in handwriting that wasn't his. By midterm, only half the class still showed up. The rest dropped out, claiming they felt sick whenever they went near the old wing. Then one Friday afternoon, everything changed. It was supposed to be a short quiz day, just 15 minutes. But the minute the door shut, the lights flickered and dimmed. The tick of the backward clock filled the silence like a heartbeat. "Okay, Mr. Landry said nervously. "Let's make this quick." He turned to write on the board and froze. The words were already there, written in long, uneven letters. "Do not stay after dark." The chalk was still in the tray, untouched. The students whispered among themselves. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was a prank. But when Mr. Landry tried to erase the writing, the chalk smeared into something else, an image of the classroom itself, but empty. He dropped the eraser, heart pounding. The lights went out. It wasn't just darkness, it was absence. The kind of void that felt thick and alive. Somewhere in the blackness, he heard the scrape of chair legs on the floor. Someone, or something, was moving. "Everyone, stay where you are," he shouted. Then, faintly, a voice. "Mr. Landry." It was Tyler. But the voice wasn't coming from where Tyler had been sitting. It came from the walls. Mr. Landry fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, revealing rows of empty desks. No students. Just dust and silence. He staggered toward the door and yanked it open. Behind it wasn't the hallway. It was the same classroom. The same desks. The same chalkboard. Only now, everything was covered in a fine layer of ash, as if decades had passed. And sitting at the back was a version of himself, older, gaunt, eyes sunken. The older Mr. Landry looked up slowly, chalk in hand, and whispered, "It doesn't end." The flashlight flickered. When it came back on, the old version was gone. The room was normal again, or as normal as it could be. The students were back, trembling, clutching their desks. He dismissed class early that day. But when they left, one girl, Maya, stayed behind. She was pale, eyes wide. "Mr. Landry," she said quietly, "I saw myself. In the corner. When the lights went out." He didn't respond. He couldn't. Because he'd seen her too. But in the reflection of the window, her other self hadn't disappeared when she did. It was still standing there, smiling faintly, long after the real Maya walked away. That night, Mr. Landry packed up his things. He left the classroom key on the desk and walked out, not bothering to lock the door. But when he reached the parking lot, his phone buzzed. A message. From his own number. It was a photo of him sitting in room 213, facing the chalkboard. The timestamp said 8:45 p.m. He turned, looking back toward the building. All the lights were off, except one. Room 213 glowed faintly, a cold, pale light pulsing from behind its windows. The next morning, the janitor found the classroom empty again. No books. No papers. No Mr. Landry. But the chalkboard was full. Every inch was covered in writing, looping, and desperate. Dozens of names, dates, fragments of lessons. And one final message written in thick, jagged letters. "Time doesn't pass here. It feeds." The school sealed off the old wing again, claiming structural instability. But students still whisper about room 213. Sometimes, they say, if you pass that hallway after dark, you'll see light under the door. And if you listen closely, you'll hear chalk scratching against the board. A man's voice, still teaching to no one. And when the bell rings, the echo doesn't fade. It lingers. Like time itself, looping endlessly, hungry,